There are 2 microphones already set up. That saves me from running to have to run all over the place with the mic, trying to get to you with your hand up in the air. So if you have a question that you would like to ask, just hop up and you can line up behind the microphones, and when you're done, you can sit down and listen to the answer. And you can address it to one of our speakers, one of our guests directly, or you can pose it and then they'll jockey to see who's going to take this one. And if it's really hard, Karoline has to answer it because she works here. All right, so if you have a question you'd like to ask, then please, this would be a great time to stand up and approach one of the microphones, or this will be a very short session. I've got an idea. Why don't I ask the first question? I'm interested in when you, from your vantage point, whether you are a bishop or you are teaching preachers, what's the most alarming trend you've noticed in the last 5 years, and what's the most hopeful trend you've noticed in the last few years when it comes to the preaching of the church?
David, I haven't been doing this for 5 years, so I'll pass.
Yeah.
Hello.
Come on, you're making me look bad. Someone say something.
All right, I'll start. Since you haven't been introduced to me, I won't tell you who I am.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm Tom Long. I teach preaching at Candler School of Theology at Emory, and am glad to be here and look forward to talking with the larger group later. Ironically, I think that I would identify the same trend as both the most hopeful and the most alarming. I was talking with my colleagues at breakfast this morning. I think we are observing in our time a shift of genre in American preaching from narrative to wisdom. And what's happening is that narrative preaching is beginning to take on water in a variety of ways and is being criticized by the theological right, middle, and left for different reasons, but under criticism from all theological vantage points. And essentially, it is being criticized because the move to narrative preaching in our time was always an attempt to enliven a moribund Christianity that we had learned abstractly but was not a delightful thing for us. It wasn't poetically alive. And narrative was the device that we used to enliven that. In a theological amnesiac culture, though, in which there isn't anything out there taught, in many contexts, it's not true everywhere, but in many contexts, there's not a Christian memory, then narrative simply titillates rather than enlivening a moribund faith. And so we're watching a move toward more didactic or wisdom-oriented kind of preaching, shaping a faith that isn't already out there. That's encouraging to me that we're responding to a shift in the culture. What's alarming to me is that we're often being led by the megachurch pastors. I've been dancing all of my career on the grave of 3 points in a poem. Well, it's back. But it's 8 bullet points in a video clip. And wisdom can easily, in the American context, be collapsed into technique. 7 ways to keep your marriage alive. Ways to make a career satisfying. It can become simply commandeering the Christian faith and fitting it into a suburban lifestyle. And the wisdom tradition is more easily lassoed, I think, than the narrative tradition is. So I think we're going to have to be careful as we move toward a wisdom tradition.
One of the things that I'm seeing is that many preachers in the face of declining church membership, are becoming more frantic in terms of how they're going to reach the people. And in being more frantic, they are trying to respond to a genuine need, but some of the preachers that I'm thinking of have decided that, well, what they were doing before doesn't work, and so we'll go a different path. And the path that they are choosing is not necessarily one that is most biblical. It isn't one that has much necessarily to do with the gospel. But out of desperation, there's a sense of needing to try something else. And so I think that the word for those frantic preachers, and it's easy to become frantic, but the word for them is stay the course, preach the gospel, wait for the fruit. It isn't up to you to save the church. This is something that Christ will do. The church still belongs to Christ. And that's probably the most hopeful thing, that still, even in the midst of our shifting paradigms, of closing some churches and reopening others, the Spirit is still at work and wonderful things are being done.
Maybe I would situate this in the same kind of way that Tom did in terms of alarming or maybe a challenge and a hope, and that is the issue of self-disclosure in preaching, the personal story, of course, which I just did this morning, so how do I? But what I mean by that is, how does a preacher negotiate that expectation or that want when so much about what we are now experiencing through social media is about constant self-disclosure? And so where does that then come out in the sermon or in preaching in a way that communicates how this gospel has touched you? So I think that's when they say they want to hear more you. I think what they're saying is they want to hear more how this story has moved you. I don't know if they want to hear about you, like what you had for breakfast or, what you're going to put on your Facebook today. But I think they want to hear where this word has touched you and moved you. And I want to hear that too. And maybe it's not in a personal story or fully self-disclosed or fully transparent, but there's something in the preaching that the congregation hears, this has done something to you. And it becomes personal in a different kind of way. So that's one thing that I think is a challenge, yet a hope, in that we can hear that personal connection, but it can be a very challenging negotiating process in your preaching.
I'll go in maybe a different direction. I resonate a lot with what they've said. One thing I've noticed more and more of in the last 5 years is more and more students who are not coming from parishes, but from camping ministry and campus ministry. And so obviously that brings real challenges. They may never have done a lot of, or any, prayers of confession. They aren't steeped in the liturgy. So there's there's a steep learning curve in all of that. On the other hand, I've noticed in these students this amazing falling in love with Scripture that happens. And they don't bring all the bad habits that we give them when we've been in the church nurturing them. And so they come ready to do exactly what Karoline just said, and to dig in deeply between the lines. I mean, all these, they're really on fire. It's not that those who don't come from those places aren't on fire. It's just that there's a freshness and newness that in some ways is really challenging as a teacher. You know, I can't count on the fact that my students have heard a lot of preaching, even. But on the other hand, when the classroom setting is set, I mean, when we're right in their face and we're working together in a workshop environment, it's really amazing to see how they grow. And to think that those gifts are going out into the church, well, you know, kind of reminds me of how it must have been for all those new converts, you know, that we read about in Scripture, who go out just totally on fire. Philip out into Samaria, whoa, just converts the whole place. So, so that's been an interesting thing to notice. And I used to worry about it a lot, and I've stopped worrying because I'm seeing that they are managing really well, even beyond us, many of them.
I had a talk with an older pastor, even older than I am, and a couple days ago. And he's a wonderful pastor, and has been a pastor of large congregations and so on. And he just was one of those who voted to leave the ELCA. So I thought it had to do with the sexuality issue. He said, oh, it's not so much for the sexuality issue for me at my age. He said, I have always preached for faith, that people might have faith and get faith and so on. And now he says that we've moved to a point where we preach assuming that there is faith. And so you are people of faith, and I would draw that out, if you know, of you. I have moved from being more focused on the preaching part of the service to now say preaching is table talk, or it's water talk. It's kind of what happens when we gather around the table, you know, that we allow Christ to speak to us and so on. So that's kind of an assuming that there's faith. How do you respond to that? Because I think he's not out in some left field someplace, but he just thinks that we have moved from to say you've got to have faith and you've got to believe, to the point where you've been baptized, you are part of the believing community, and this is now how you live it out, and so on. So now he says he thinks that's the difference between two groups within the ELCA. Now, I don't know if he's right or wrong, but you can respond. Good to see you. You too.
I said Tom.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Tom.
I appreciate that question very much, and I want to be obedient to it, but I want to reframe it a little bit. I don't think that the tension ought to be posed as between proclaiming a faith to which we are called and affirming a faith in which we are walking. But I have been convinced, especially by reading about Augustine as a preacher, that Augustine was aware of the fact, in a way that I am now aware, that we do not speak to congregations anymore. We speak to multiple constituencies. We have clusters out there. And so Augustine did not pretend to preach a one-size-fits-all sermon. He would, in the context of one sermon, explicitly address different constituencies. So he would speak to the catechumens, the ones who don't know anything yet. And he would say, now those of you who have been around here for a long time, you relax, you know all this. Then he would speak to those who were veteran Christians, turn to the catechumens and say, I'm going to speak language that is mysterious to you, but you will learn these mysteries one day. Then he would speak to the pagans. I know you're in here for entertainment. Well, we've got some entertainment. Look at the Eucharist. So, negotiating a hearing with multiple groups I think, is a tremendous but energizing challenge before preaching today. Not pretending we've got one kind of person out there listening to us. Yeah.
Come from a small United Methodist church in Chicago, and I got 10 minutes. We have communion every week, yay! But I have 10 minutes, and it's a very biblically illiterate group, and we're really trying to. So I do feel I resonate with what you were saying, Karoline, about helping people to connect about all these connections that are in the Bible. So the question is, in 10 minutes, how to share a piece of this wonderful book and also preach and maybe teach. It's hard. It's hard in 10 minutes. I just get going in 10 minutes. And I do, we still go till 5 or 10 after because of communion, and I'm not going to cut that short. So just some advice on those of us who have short constraints there. Anybody? Thanks.
Oh, the 10-minute. Is the Episcopalian on this one? Oh, yeah. The answer is, that's right. Well, I do think, I remember in the old debates of the 3-point in the poem kind of sermons and all that kind of stuff, I remember hearing an old preacher say, well, every sermon ought to have at least 1 point. I mean, that's and I've started to I'm beginning to realize there's probably some wisdom in that, and that I've in my experience, one of the things I've learned, if I play a little game with myself when I'm getting ready to preach, and I ask myself, okay, somebody comes up to you and say, what's your sermon about in 1 sentence? Yeah. And if I can't say it in 1 sentence, that probably, this is for me, everybody will be different. For me, that means I probably haven't digested it and integrated it enough so that kind of summary sentence, you were actually getting at something similar yesterday in your talk, the ability to focus in on, here's a point that I'm hearing in this message. And zeroing in on that like a laser. And then other stuff may spin off of it, but that one, it's almost like Jesus saying to either Martha or Mary, whichever one it was, look, Martha, was it Martha? Mary is, who was busy? Martha?
Martha was busy.
Oh, yeah. Whichever one was busy. Yeah. Martha's busy about whole things, but Mary has found that one thing is needful. And I've begun to realize that if I can hear that one thing that is needful for me in some sense in this time and moment, that maybe that's enough. And that's a point of departure, that it doesn't need 10 points. It doesn't need 7 points, like you're saying, 15 bullets in a conclusion, or 3 bullets in a poem. One thing. And that one thing might actually do it. And then the timing, just as a practical thing.
You can come teach for us anytime. That's perfect.
If there are any students out there, you know what we're talking about. Focus. Yeah. Right? 1 focus, not 5, but 1, because what we're thinking of, some of these, an issue with regard to this is actually oral communication, right? Because statistics show, and this is just basic public speaking statistics, that 65% of what you are speaking about is actually understood while you're speaking. Okay? So you got 65% in an ideal world of what I said this morning during that. Now, we're a couple hours later, you're down to 40. And 3 days later, you're down to 10, remembering what I said. So I think in that question is, how can we increase those odds? And that's where it comes down to the 1 point. What's the one thing you want them to hang their hat on? What's the one thing you want them to remember? And I think there's this panic, though, that I can't just say one thing. A whole sermon on one thing? How am I going to build a whole sermon around, so then there's this, okay, I need to make all of these connections, and you'll completely overwhelm them, right? You need to make one connection, but then you build a whole I use the term in my teaching, word hoard, or image hoard, where if you're building this image or building this idea, creating this idea for them to take with them, what are all the different ways that you're saying the same thing? You know, so if I'm talking about Jesus as shepherd, what am I going to use? Pen, flock, sheep, right? That's rhetorical strategy. And so part of recognizing how am I going to, I think it's okay that it's one thing. I think it needs to be one thing. And then it needs to be how you're increasing the percentages of that remembering that one thing.
I think we've got a problem here, though, because I just told her that she has to tell the catechumens one thing, and she's got to tell the... and so we've got some conflicting advice, maybe. I wonder if part of what would endorse what my colleagues are saying in a good way is if we remember that the pulpit is not the only place where this communication takes place, and that sometimes the best compliment to a sermon is, I never thought about it that way. Is there a place I could find out more about that? And then there better be a place where they can find out more about that.
Sometimes in the electives that I teach, in fact, I do this a lot, I have the students preach 5-minute sermons, and often on the same text. And we do it sort of one after another. And what they say to me, of course, you know this from teaching, from preaching 10 minutes. I'm looking for, there she is, yeah. Is that preaching for 5 minutes is a lot harder than preaching for 20 minutes. On the other hand, the other thing they notice is that hearing 3 5-minute sermons is an amazing experience, even on the same text, because the preachers tend to have worked harder to keep it focused and crisp and a thing of beauty, actually. And then the sense that there can be 3 completely different takes on the same text that lifts you up in this way is remarkable. So I wonder sometimes if we could just mix it up. I mean, 5 minutes might seem like a real gift if you're only supposed to use 10. If you have 2 people or 3 or 4, to offer a different experience of what proclamation can look like. So maybe part of what I want to say is move the box around, move the shape of the box a little bit, see if that does something not only for your listeners but for you as a preacher.
10 minutes can be a real gift to the congregation if the sermon is boring. You can do a lot in 10 minutes, and in 10 minutes you can still have some way of moving them to some point of conviction and also moving them to some point of liberation. But I would say that if you preach for 10 minutes and there is no tension within it, you've got a boring sermon. You can preach an image of a text and get snagged and get caught up in the imagery and never get to the theological point of it. But if you are speaking to the heart of the people, if you're speaking to a need in the people, if you've identified a need within yourself, then when you preach, you also, I like the fact that there's the word reach within it. When we preach, if we preach and we are reaching for the very truth that we are trying to proclaim, not that we have it, not that we possess it, but that we're trying to grasp onto it even as we proclaim it, then it becomes an exciting adventure, both for them and for you. So I think that in 10 minutes we can do a lot, and sometimes more than in 20 minutes.
Second part of that question, too, about it's 10 minutes, but it's also in a congregation that knows very little about the Bible. When I was a junior, going into my junior year in high school, I was at a school that lived and breathed and ate soccer. And we took a trip to Ireland, a soccer tour, and all-night flight. I arrived at my host family's house. I was too polite to take a nap, even though they offered me the chance to take a nap. So I sat down with them and I watched cricket. I'd never seen cricket. And I was too tired to get interested, and it was so boring. I think church has a lot of people who have grown up playing soccer or football or basketball, or they've been knitting or putting puzzles together, and they get an hour of cricket each week because they don't know the rules of the game. Like, I didn't know anything about this game. I didn't know the rules, I didn't know the players, I didn't know the characters, I didn't know it was a foul, I didn't know it was a great play, and it was just death. And so if fewer and fewer people know the biblical story, how do we avoid this being like my experience with cricket? Where they come and they know a couple of the names, but they don't know the story, they don't know the characters, they don't know the scenes, they don't know what's dramatic, they don't know what's meaningful. And we can offer other educational opportunities, but the primary opportunity to reach our congregation is in worship and during the sermon. And so I'm wondering what you're thinking about. How do we preach the Scriptures, but how do we teach the Scriptures? And maybe that's part of the tension between narrative and wisdom, but I don't think it has to be. And I'm curious what you think about the preacher's responsibility in this day to teach the story so that the game, all that we do, is actually meaningful.
I'd like to jump in on that if I could. I was at a church on Sunday in Calgary that is an emergent church. And one of the principles of their worship is that they're trying to reach the digital generation, and the digital generation has all the teaching they want as quickly as they want. And when they come to church, they aren't looking for teaching. They can get that kind of information elsewhere. What they're looking for is an experience of God. And it was a challenging kind of analysis or kind of way to approach worship, to think of that's what they're looking for, an experience of God. Well, there are two things in that. One is that it's an experience. They're looking for an experience. But the other thing is identifying that it is of God. So it's challenged me. I've been thinking about the emergent church movement, and it really is challenging me to wonder, well, what is biblical preaching going to be? Is biblical preaching going to be the kind that teaches texts that seem remote to seekers? Like the Bible is a barrier to someone who's never been to church. Why are you reading from that text? So is there a way that we have to kind of turn biblical preaching on its head, instead of us standing at the front and teaching these texts and this information? Try and reduce what we're teaching to a kind of a need-to-know basis. On this Sunday, what do you need to know? Do you really need to know all of the relatives of Joseph? It's going to be rather looking to try and pare it down and hook them with something that has to do with the culture and lead them into the Bible, pointing them into the Bible, rather than maybe fully explicating it in the sermon itself. I don't know. But I do think that the people, if they aren't led to the Bible to read it themselves, then there's no point us trying to teach it to them.
You know, I do think that, and I've been out of the parish for a number of years, so I don't get to do this as much, but one of the things that I've found helpful, and I have to admit, I mean, it's already there, is exploit the liturgical year. Yeah. There's a gift there. I mean, it's really there. Exploit it, and so that the sermon isn't the only thing where the word is getting cracked open. And so that everything from education and formation kind of stuff. I mean, when I was at St. James, Baltimore, I used to jokingly tell staff, I said, we're going to get a biblically literate Episcopal congregation one way or another. We're going to do it. I said, if we had to put Bible passages on the toilet paper, we're going to do it. And, you know, just everything was telling the story. Everything was, and it wasn't proof texting or anything like that. I mean, but everything from, in those days, bulletins. I mean, we didn't have webs yet, but website. I mean, every avenue. I mean, you know, do the Francis of Assisi thing. If they don't know the story, make up a manger. You know, I mean, exploit everything, because it's there, and now we've got more media with which to do it. So that, I mean, I used to do stuff. I mean, I went overboard. I used to do these series of sermons. This was in the summer, and I think I was really trying to keep folk in church in the summer. But I did this series on Daniel, and I made the mistake of it being like 12 weeks for the whole summer. And I remember my daughter, who was like 10, said, "Is Daniel going to be dead yet?" It was sort of like, when's he going to die? Like I said, I went overboard on that. But the thing was, I used to say, all right, here's what we're going to work on this week, and here's the part of the story, and do that kind of thing. And I said, now next week, here's your homework. And the congregation had homework to do. there's something to do. I want y'all to think about this or watch this on TV and take a look at this passage while you're doing it and all that. I mean, just all that, just exploiting in the best sense of exploiting, to bring out. Because those opportunities are there so that the sermon then kind of becomes a crystallization of what's going on in the atmosphere all around.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and in that sense, what we're teaching is not information processing. It's we're teaching a grammar of the Christian life, so that people then can use that grammar to create sentences that never were about what you were talking about today.
Just one other, because that's the underlying concern, right? Is how do we maintain that language of the faith? You know, how do we continue to nurture the language of the faith? And so I think to acknowledge that and to say the ways in which we are imagining, I think your comment, Michael, is very helpful, that all of that can happen around the sermon as well. But that we do imagine as a process of relanguaging and recommitting ourselves to a constant reinterpretation, but building on these traditions that we know, but a way in which we're recontextualizing them. So, go ahead, sorry.
I'm a little surprised. I'm hearing a lot of the art of preaching. I want to hear more about the inspired preaching, the relationship with the text, the relationship with God. Is I think that people are looking more for the witness of the preacher and not just the art.
Book called The Witness of Preaching, so
What I have written, I have written.
No, I just
I think I don't want to take a scalpel and separate the inspiration and witness too far from craft, because the most powerful experiences, I think, for preachers of witnessing and inspiration happen when they put one foot in front of the other and go about the business of crafting a sermon. Exegesis can be mountaintop, but you have to do it one step at a time. You have to get out the books, and you have to look at the word studies, and you have to do this, and you don't even know what you're looking for. It's like going down into a cave with a dim flashlight, and you can see names written on the wall of others who've been there before you, Brueggemann and so on. And and then all of a sudden, your flashlight flashes on the glint of gold embedded in the wall, and you see something so dazzling that you fall on your knees and you rush to the mouth of the cave. And it's Sunday morning, and you say, "Follow me, I can't wait to show you this." So the inspiration comes out of the workmanship. That's the wrong word, gender-inclusive workmanship, whatever that is.
That's good. That's really helpful. Another metaphor I've started using with my student. Oh, there we go. Another metaphor, in addition to that, I've started using with my students is to say to them, okay, when you become a pastor, you also take on a new life partner. And that's this text. And you now have a marriage with this word that requires you to fall in love. And we all know that being in love and staying in love and living together is hard work, actually, and not all that romantic. But there's a sense in which the preachers I know who seem to have renewal week after week are those who take that really seriously. And not that there isn't drudgery. I mean, someone's got to do the dishes, but who also understand that in order for their preaching to be inspired and to even be artful, they have to nurture this life partner. and the relationship there, or they can't possibly hope to have anyone listening to them say, I would love to have that life partner too. You know, I mean, who wants to get married if all you hear is fighting? You know, and if the preacher looks like the preacher this is just a total chore, and inspiration is just sent in my head way back when I first saw the Bible and found, you know, well then that communicates. So trying to think of ways to do that. I mean, maybe we should even talk about, you know, date nights or stuff. I don't know. You all should I don't know. Whatever works. You know, yeah, no, you can get...
I would add just a couple of things to that, Kelly. One is one thing that and this is a colleague that used to be with Anna, Chuck Campbell uses this concept of dislocated exegesis, where where do we usually read the text? And by the way, my second point was that you should hear the text. Have someone read it to you. Don't follow along, just listen. That can be a moment of inspiration. How do you feel, right? And so I just did my second point first. So now I'll go to my first point, and that's this idea of dislocated exegesis. Because where do we do our text study? In our study, in our office, maybe at home, but that's where it usually is. But what happens when you take that word and go sit? One of my favorite places is Starbucks. I get out my computer, and I have every single time I'm there, I have someone come over to me and say, "Who are you? What do you do? What are you writing? You know, what do you?" And then the regulars, "What are you working on today, Karoline?" And they'll say something that I think, yeah. Or on a park bench, or at a wine bar. That's another one of my favorite places. But where are you taking this word and going outside of your usual place, and how that word then is reincarnated in a different location?
Professor said to me, you can't give away what you haven't received.
I suppose I'm one of Bishop Curry's long-lost sheep, an Episcopal priest from North Carolina who lives in Minnesota. My question is about pastoral preaching at funerals. Even in the Episcopal Church, you're going to have requests for family members and friends to offer a remembrance, and you can say, now, could you please keep it to 3 minutes? And then there are those moments when 15 minutes later, the train has left the station and sometimes is going in the wrong direction. And you hear a lot of sometimes minor details about life that isn't really about living. And we're supposed to be talking about life and death. And then you have to stand up and everyone else is already ready to run for the doors, and you're supposed to redeem that. Do you have any advice about that, pastoral preaching, given the current cultural context?
Tom wrote a book about that too.
Scribble, scribble, scribble. I'm going to give a lecture about funeral preaching.
I'll be
so
here.
Eschatological promise, I will deal with that.
Thank you. Okay.
I had a guy one time that started preaching, just about had an altar call right there in the middle of the funeral. My question is predicated on an article you wrote, Dr. Long, about plagiarism in the sermon, and so I would like to hear from some of the others their ideas about plagiarism.
I talked about that last year because it's been on my mind a lot. It's a big issue in Atlanta. We've had some big cases about that. And I guess what I've come to realize is that there are sermons all over the internet. It's like a crack dealer on every corner of your computer. And And let's get real, that's addictive stuff, right? I mean, the best reason I know not to try crack is that you won't be able to do it once, right? Or heroin, I'm told. I mean, and those of you who maybe are with people who, I mean, you know, this is serious stuff. And I want to go on record saying that downloading sermons at 3 a.m. Sunday morning out of desperation because you think your life and death is at stake here is your first hit of heroin. And you'll do it again. And what you've sold is not, I don't want to go so far as to say you've sold your soul. That's God's call. But what you've sold is your ability to communicate and convey to the congregation that you are in love with this word, and so you strive, like they do, to find something good to give. You have decided what you are communicating that what you have to offer ain't any good. And that's like serving food with massive amounts of, what do you call it? All that, you know what I'm saying, added ingredients, you know, not whole food, the stuff with all the preservatives that's going to make you sick. And I will say that the preachers I know who've done it have not been able to stop. So we know this is addictive stuff, and so part of what has to happen is that we've got to have some conversations that begin to draw a line and hold one another accountable, because we're all going to borrow. I mean, and there isn't any one of us who hasn't borrowed too much. You know, you sort of have to have that experience of borrowing too much before you know how much is too much, and then it's not yours anymore. You know, we've all done that. So that's the first thing I want to say. And the second is, you know, don't let the culture fool you. It was you talked about the Randy, what's his name, the ethicist in the New York Times, who said, Randy Cohen, right, who wrote this article, you know, he's usually coherent, okay? I don't know what he was doing. Obviously, this guy never talked to a preacher. But he said it was not a terrible thing for preachers who have, you know, ministers to preach one another's sermons. Well, that's what happens then is that we're going to start preaching the empire's sermons. It will be a very short step, I think, before the sermons we download are pretty carefully controlled. Because the tempter knows what we want, which is just to find an available sermon. Did I scare everybody enough with that? I really try hard with my students to say, I will find you and hurt you if I know that you're doing this, so get some help.
I just would add, I would add one thing to that. What is the preaching process about? It's a conversation. I use the image of a triangle, then based on the ancient rhetorical triangle. But it's a conversation between the text, you, the preacher, the text, the logos, the word made flesh, and the congregation, constantly. And so when that happens, you've sold the congregation. They're out of the sermon completely. The context is completely gone, and the word becomes this actually excarnated word and not an incarnated word for this time, this place, these people, and this purpose.
Did we mention that you'll get caught? There's always that. No, I'm serious, and for a lot of us, that's why we start addictive behavior, right? Because we really secretly want to get caught. You will. So you can also hold that out there as a...
I attended the convocation this year at Luther Seminary, and I was so struck by Pastor Householder when he used the phrase moving from biblical literacy to biblical fluency. And I think that the presentation we had yesterday with the rereading really got to that place of biblical fluency, Well, I'm in my first call, 2007 graduate from Luther, and I've been very blessed to work with the senior pastor. I'm an associate pastor, and we get along very well. But one of the great gifts is that he has a doctorate in spiritual disciplines. And I've just been so amazed that there's so much out there, whether it be Lectio or centering prayer. And I'm just wondering, this might be a little vulnerable, but I'm just wondering, what have been your spiritual practices to really move from biblical literacy to biblical fluency to help you have that living word come to life for you? And has that changed and evolved throughout your preaching ministry?
Oh, I'm still against plagiarism as well. I'm against it. You know, I have. I go off and on with practices related, but I've lived with sort of the discipline of the monastic offices with at least 2 a day. I mean, I don't do them all day, but 2 a day. Even it's been hard, it gets a little harder the more frenetic the schedule gets, but I still do 2 offices a day, and part of the reasons I do those. The Episcopal tradition, but there are a number of traditions of them, is that forces me into scripture that I wouldn't go to. I mean, right now in our daily office, Hosea is the big thing. I wouldn't, if you asked me to pick a book in the Bible, I mean, Hosea might get in there, but Obadiah wouldn't have a chance. Well, the lectionary actually forces me into parts of scripture I just wouldn't go if I was picking and choosing. I've also used Lectio. I mean, I've really started the listening to Scripture and just kind of more listening, not just reading it in the context of the offices. And so my Bible study has now grown around that in addition to whatever. But that discipline, that regularity, for me, is really helpful because, to be honest, I'm lazy and I know it. And so I need a structure of some sort, and then I can hang my hat on it. But I need something to ground me in Scripture in the regular study that may or may not be related to preaching a sermon or doing a talk. But I'm amazed at the number of things that come out of that over time. But so for me, that has been really valuable. And I've dabbled in centering prayer off and on over time. But what has worked for me has been Lectio, the listening for a word from the Word, and that really, for an extrovert like me, that has, I went on silent retreat and almost went mad, but for me, that really does feed me, and I find over time, stuff speaks. You do hear it, especially if you write it down so you can remember, but that's just one practice for me that's helpful. Tom's got a book on this. Would you check?
I'll say 2 things. We'll go down the road. We're going to put our guy on the spot so much. There are a few things that I always do. One is I write it out and carry it around with me and try to learn it by heart, the Scripture. Because not so I can make a big deal about it when I preach, but because that helps me get it in me. And as soon as I get it in me, I can't get it out of me, and that's really good because then it's following me around and bothering me. So that's the first thing I always do. The second thing I've started doing, and it really is the older I get and the less embarrassed I get, is I just go up to random people and ask them to read the text with me and ask what they think. And depending on where I am, like I have 2 teenage sons, and I spend a lot of time, used to be at soccer games, now it's lacrosse practice. And it's kind of like what Karoline said, you get to be a regular, and you might as well exploit, I like that word, exploit the eccentricity of our profession, which is that you really ought to be a lot weirder than you look. It ought to be the kind of thing where, that's the good thing about a collar, right? Is that people know immediately who you are, and that's an identification thing. We get to blend a little more, those of us who don't wear a collar all the time, and that can be unhealthy. And we try to blend with our word, and you really don't need to, because it's an interesting thing to just ask people what they think. What do you think? What do you see here? And don't expect them to sit down for an hour or half an hour or whatever, but just 5 minutes. And people always have something interesting to say, and they really are kind of glad you asked. And if they don't want to, that's fine too. So I've become less embarrassed about doing that, and really grateful for the insight of other human beings. Imagine that, that with all the books on my shelf and all the wisdom that's available to me, it's random conversations that often are the place where the Spirit moves.
I'll add two things. The first is I realized I was doing this, but hadn't necessarily put this language to it, but I was just at the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit at which is at the university or at the Minnesota Science Museum, and after the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit is an exhibit on the St. John's Bible, and of course the central piece of this is actually a recapturing or going back to Visio Divina of imagining God. Okay, what is this? What is this text? What is the image that this text is pulling out of you? And I realize that's how I do exegesis. As I was talking about yesterday, I connect images and I build them in my head, and so that's been a very important part of my spiritual practice. When it comes to preaching, of imagination and creativity. And that was a helpful thing to realize going to that exhibit. The second thing, which I'm not sure totally relates, but I think we were talking about this last night at dinner, I'm not very good at being still and know that I am God. I'm really, really bad at it. And I've always been that way. And so I have to practice being still. I have to practice being in the moment. And I had to figure out a way to do that. Otherwise, it will never happen. And if you don't practice something, you don't get good at it, right? So I do yoga because it is the one time in my week, day, whatever it is, that I'm totally in the moment of the mind, body, spirit. And I practice that. And that feeling carries over into the ability to be in the presence of God, be in the moment of God, be still and know that I am God, and listen for God. But I've found that I had to act that out in a really deliberate way to get me there.
For the sake of time, we're going to have just one more question. Please.
My question is, my parents had access to maybe 3 pastoral voices, the one in their home congregation and maybe one in each side of the townships. I am a seminarian inheriting a world in which I feel technology has given me 2 million voices, and more so my congregation, 2 million voices. I'm wondering if you couldn't give me some helpful pointer for how to keep my pastoral voice true with the delusion that if a congregation doesn't like my voice, there's another 1,999,900 plus voices to go to.
One of the things I'd want to say is you've got a beautiful voice, and that God called you to this act of proclamation, and that if people need to hear another voice, then maybe God is calling them to another place. But as long as God is calling you where you are, just keep on using your voice. I think the important thing for people is when we come, we aren't listening. In the first instance, we're listening to you. But in the second instance, once we understand that we are in the presence of God and that God might well be speaking even in these moments, then it's not your voice that matters so much as God's voice speaking in that time. I think, just to come back for a moment to that previous question about spirituality, your own spirituality is going to come through. And I think the most important thing that we can do as pastors is to look for grace. Spirituality is the best spirituality that we can practice, is a spirituality of grace where we don't hold back like the grace and goodness of God as though it's something that we should hoard, but rather let it flow, let it just embrace your people with love. You were talking about whether we expect the people to be believers or not. I think just affirm their faith, because that's what Jesus did. If it's this small, it is enough.
Thank you for the gifts you've given so far in preaching and teaching and that will come, but also for this time in conversation with each other and with the whole group. We will... A couple people have pulled me aside at one time or another and asked me some questions about the Doctor of Ministry program in Biblical Preaching at Luther Seminary. There is some information on the table, some brochures, but I realize that a number of graduates and current students are here at the celebration. So I'm going to ask you, if you have been in that program or are in that program, to stand up for just a moment so that you know if you have some questions, you can find one of these people and they will tell you the truth about the program. And if there is more you'd like to know, please by all means get a hold of me or the Graduate Studies office and ask. So with that in mind, I want to say thank you again to our guests and to you all, and know that we are in recess until 3:15 when we'll start sharp with the plenary address by Tom Long.